Imagine yourself in Tel Aviv, 1934. You pick up a copy of the leading literary journal, Turim. And inside you find some new poems by authors whose names still resonate today, like Natan Alterman or Leah Goldberg. But you also find dozens of works by authors who are now almost completely forgotten, like Eliyahu Maitus or Ari Glazman. If you wanted to learn about the culture, the society, the literary trends of the period, to which text should you turn? There's an obvious temptation to start with those we now think of as the masters, like Alterman and Goldberg. Their works still resonate today because they were so good, right? They have a timeless element to them. The problem is that what makes great writers relevant to us does not necessarily make them representative of wider historical trends. In a sense, what makes great writers timeless makes them less of their own time. And accordingly, if we want to learn about the broader literary culture of a period, it might be more useful to study a text that now seems completely outdated, a text that was only relevant in its own time. How do we find the outdated text, however, when we turn to pre-modern literature? The Altermans and Goldbergs of the past are still printed every now and then, but to find the outdated works, we need to turn to manuscripts. And when I say manuscripts in the pre-modern sense, I don't mean drafts or sketches for works, but literally books written by hand, which was the only way to write a book before the invention of print. And we have today thousands and thousands of pre-modern Hebrew manuscripts that still survive. The National Library of Israel lists almost 95,000 digitized manuscripts, more than 1 million pages of Hebrew texts. And many of these texts exist only as manuscript. They were never printed. If we want to learn about the culture, the society, the literary trends of a pre-modern period, then that's the corpus of texts we should be looking at. Now, I study a specific set of outdated writers and their works. I work on Hebrew literature in Renaissance Italy, or more specifically in the 15th century. And 15th century was a time of intellectual and artistic boom in Italy. It's the Renaissance. And Jewish writers who were living in Italy were also influenced by this sweeping cultural movement. A couple of them became the Altermans and Goldbergs of Renaissance Hebrew literature. These are the celebrities. You'll find them online and in the textbooks. But if we follow the manuscripts, we find many, many other authors. And although most of these people are virtually unknown today, most of their works were never printed, these lost Hebrew-Italian names were the backbone of a lively literary culture. And I worked to reconstruct this culture by looking at their lost manuscripts and works. One of these authors provides us with a special entrance into the world of Renaissance Hebrew poetry. And that author is Yosef Zark. Zark is a very crucial figure for my research for several reasons. One is that we simply have a lot of his works that still survive. More than 100 poems that he wrote are still extant, which is exceptional for a poet from this period. But more importantly, Zark's works seem to be representative of wider trends in Jewish culture. And we know that because Zark corresponded with many people, people requested his poems, and he was eventually hired to write for some of the wealthiest and most influential Jewish families in Italy at that period. Zark collected all his correspondence with other writers, including other writers' poems, in one book. This book is called Niv Sfatayim, Fruit of the Lips. You can see its frontispiece here. And because Niv Sfatayim is practically a contemporary anthology of letters and poems by Zark and his peers, this book allows me exactly to move from the analysis of one isolated author to the analysis of a group or a network of writers. And I can map different sort of personal and poetic interactions between these people who are all living in Italy and writing to one another constantly. But right now, I want to focus on Zark himself and on some of his poems. How do we read a poem that nobody read for over 600 years? So there are several preparations we must go through before we ask the big questions about culture and literary trends. The first thing we have to do is actually read the manuscript. So can any of you read the first line here? This is Hebrew, but it's a very difficult script to read, not exactly Arial font. And especially when we encounter new unknown texts, deciphering such manuscripts can be challenging. In this case, this is one of several incomplete copies of Niv Sfatayim, and it's the hardest one to read. But we can learn to read it by comparing this difficult font to the text of other manuscripts that are easier to read and contain some overlapping passages. And it's really like learning the script of a new language. You go word by word, you learn to decipher the shape of each letter until we can move on and read new texts. So great, let's say we can read the letters. We still need to ask, what do these words actually say? And unfortunately, poets like to use strange words. That's part of the game of poetry. And in pre-modern Hebrew poetry in particular, every word that is remotely related to the Bible is fair game. And here's a short example of this. In one poem, Zark asks a friend if he finds the poem nivzeh, foul, is this a bad poem? Or is it nechmad umeragag? Now, Hebrew speakers will know that nechmad is lovely or nice, but what exactly is meragag, right? So it turns out to be a synonym of nechmad, and it's based on the Aramaic translation of the Bible. So because it's the Bible, it's fair game, you can use it, but you, the reader, should really know it, right? There's an expectation. And the hundreds of Hebrew Renaissance poems that I'm working on contain endless little puzzles like this, strange words, difficult phrases that we have to decipher. These, however, are just the groundworks. Once we can read the letters, we understand what the poems literally say, we can finally ask, what do these poems teach us? What can we learn from them about culture, society, and the literary trends? And I'll end by sharing with you some of my preliminary findings about the world of Hebrew Renaissance poetry. So the first thing we can say is that in Renaissance Italy, Hebrew poetry was everywhere. Students were expected to write poems to their teachers. Poems were sung in weddings. They were attached to letters. They were carved on objects in houses. And in Niv Svatayim, we even find a poem that Zark explains that was sung outside of the room where the groom and bride first consummate their marriage, which was actually an Italian tradition. So poetry really permeated everywhere. A second thing we see is a growing fascination with science. Many poems, for example, are dedicated to scientific objects and gadgets. And my favorite in this category is a poem that Zark wrote in praise of the urinal, which was a transparent vessel used for the analysis of urine samples, very much the predecessor of our modern urine test. And in Zark's poem, the urinal itself boasts of his wisdom. I'll read it first in Hebrew. Hodu lichli sheten, ki li chokhma v'da'at midarda, ma koach rofe bitzofe, b'mar'a elav etvada. So in a loose English translation, praise or give praise to the vessel of urine, for I am wiser and more knowledgeable than Darda, who is a mythological biblical sage. What power does the doctor who inspects me have? He simply looks at me and knows. So the urinal says the doctors are actually redundant, right? Doctors simply get all the knowledge from staring at their instruments, but they don't know anything on their own. And this is obviously a humorist poem, but it expresses genuine excitement about contemporary scientific instruments, and it also reflects the emergence of technology as a new major source of authority. In the Middle Ages, doctors were almost the personification of knowledge. But here, technology takes over the doctor's place. We are encouraged to defer to the instrument and not to the person. And that's the beginning of the modern discourse about science, technology, medicine, and their balance with the human factor that we are still grappling today. Finally, take a look at this line from another poem. With the kisses of my mouth, men and women savored my good taste. Now, who do you think the speaker is in this poem? It might look a little bit like a love poem, I think, on a first blush, right? It has kisses, it has a bit of a Song of Songs kind of vibe. But this is not a poem about free love. It's actually about the cuclaro, which is an old Italian word for a spoon, which we all kiss when we use it to eat. And this poem represents a third major trend of the period, which is poems dedicated to low, everyday kind of objects and activities. And we find poems about chairs, phylacteries, sweet desserts, or book bindings. And these are all objects that previously were not even considered worthy of poetry, but with the new sensitivities of the Renaissance, the new interest in simple everyday life, these objects are rendered poetic through writing. Zark probably did not think his poems are going to last forever. In one poem he writes, "My actions are reckless, my poems are strange. Half awake, half asleep, I play my instrument." And I think this poem captures something of the essence of Zark's writings. His poems do not try to transcend time, and they look funny, updated, outdated, a bit strange to a modern reader. But through the virtue of being so marvelously outdated, Zark's poems reveal and revive a culture and a period that fell out of memory. Altogether, when we take a look at these lost works of Hebrew Italian poetry, we can start to imagine the lively literary culture that once existed in Italy. It was a society steeped with poetry, fascinated by science and celebrating the simple joys of life and kitchen appliances. And we can glimpse at these works exactly by going beyond the timeless, by looking at the poems that are not eternal and transcendent, but intimately of their own time. Thank you very much.